very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see everyone on this January afternoon. I think we have an interesting topic to talk about. We're very pleased to have Andranik Migranyan here to give us a Russian perspective on the U.S. Russia relationship. For those of you who have not previously met or read Dr. Migranyan's work, he's currently a professor at the Moscow State Institute for International Relations, which is Russia's premier foreign affairs university, formally subordinate to the Russian Foreign Ministry. He, until a few years ago, was based in New York for several years, directing the Russian Institute for Democracy and Cooperation in New York, which was a, can we call it a quasi-governmental entity in New York, pursuing research and also some exchange programs. Andranik is a very independent and I think creative and provocative thinker, certainly reflecting, I think, mainstream perspectives in Russia today, but also very much speaking in his own voice, I guess I would say. He's been an independent thinker for quite a long time. He joined, unlike many of his generation, particularly many accomplished people of his generation, did not join the Communist Party actually until the tail end of the perestroika period during the Gorbachev era. Andranik became fairly quickly an advisor to President Boris Yeltsin on his presidential council, and got a lot of attention in, I guess it was the late Soviet period, for a major article that he wrote arguing that Russia would not be able to move directly from its communist experience to democracy, and that it would have to 89 would have to go through an authoritarian transition in order to become a democracy, which was a very controversial thesis at the time. But anyway, we're really delighted to have Andranik with us today. Obviously complex topic, the issue of U.S. Russia relations. There are a lot of perspectives in Russia. There are a lot of perspectives in the United States, and we're looking forward to having a vibrant conversation. Andranik, please.
Thank you, Paul. It's always a pleasure to be here because this is one of the few places in the United States where there is a possible this kind of open exchange of views on our relations, and where I hope nobody is prosecuted after this kind of events, because what we hear in Moscow and in your media when we are reading, we are hearing a lot about the echo of McCarthyist period in 50s, 60s, and we are really a bit scary what's going on here. And I just wanted to start by a joke, my thoughts about current situation. Yesterday when I was thinking what's going on in our relations and how this situation internally in America is helping us, I decided that when Soviet Union collapsed, everybody was hungry, people didn't know how to feed themselves, how to find the jobs. The only compensation for us was 2 serials. One serial shot in United States, Santa Barbara, and another in Mexico, Rich Also Are Crying. And, our people didn't have they don't have warm, they don't have enough food, they don't have job. But every evening they were sitting at the television, watching these serials and
Soap operas.
This helped former Soviet people to survive all this very hard transitional period. Now we entered again in a very difficult situation. Oil prices fall down, economic hardships in our country. Now new soap opera came from United States and helps us. This is Trump presidency, American internal chaos and circus, which is making this great country a very ridiculous place, and everybody is laughing and joking what's going on here. But this is, of course, a joke, though this joke has, in Russian we say, in every joke there is a piece of joke.
A kernel of truth, I think is what you mean.
But in reality, it's a banality. Everybody is talking about the lowest point in our relations after the end of Cold War, but I must tell you, I have to tell you, a lot of people sitting at this table, we lived during the Cold War. I never ever remember this kind of bad relations between our two countries, even during the Soviet Union and Soviet-American confrontation in 70s, 80s, I don't know. And this is lasting for a long period, and nobody knows when it's going to end. And I would like to emphasize a couple of things and observations concerning our relations and areas where our relations are confronting each other, and about the possibilities to overcome these conflicts and these problems which are creating all this confrontation. Or even just to might be to try to formulate, is it possible to overcome, or this is our fate and it's gonna last for a long time and nobody knows when it can end and how this could be end in a long run. Of course, when we are talking about current tension in our relations, we first of all take into account the situation in Ukraine. And I would like to talk a little bit about Ukraine, Middle East, Russia's hacking in American elections, internal Russian situation at this moment, at the eve of elections, and the future of our relations based on everything which I could try to formulate. First of all, Ukraine. Of course, it's also clear for everybody that a lot of things, at least several portions of sanctions, started after Crimea. You call that annexation, we call that a reunification of Crimea with Russia, and then Donbas events, and a practically very explosive situation which appeared in Russian-Ukrainian relations. We talked about this a lot, including here. I remember our seminar with Paula Dobrenska when we were discussing at the beginning of the conflict. I just don't want to go in the history of the problem, but what is current reality? How Russia is perceiving the current situation, and what in the city politicians can expect on behalf of Russia in short run or even in long run. For Moscow, Crimean problem is closed. It's not a problem at all. It's finished. Donbas problem is more complicated. Russia is trying to leave a room for maneuver and for compromise with Kiev and with Westerners. This is the only reason why, though a lot of people and political forces are demanding from Moscow to recognize these republics, to step in, Russia is not doing this because Russia would like to have Ukraine, as many times we mentioned, and Putin mentioned that, Lavrov mentioned, to have at this moment a territorial integrity. Telling the territorial integrity, I mean Donbas inside Ukraine, some kind of solution between these self-proclaimed republics and Kiev. But three important things as a preconditions, which everybody knew that if these three preconditions could be realized several years ago, before 2014, Crimea will be in Ukraine, Donbas could be in Ukraine, and no war, no conflicts, and very good relations could be between Russia and Ukraine. Three things. First, non-bloc status of Ukraine. This is the demand for on behalf of Russia, which Russia considers very legitimate because Ukraine is an existential problem for Russia, and Russia never ever will let Ukraine to be part of NATO or any other bloc which Russia considered unfriendly or even as a foe on its borders. Ukraine is in the heart of Russia, and neither geopolitically nor psychologically, nor in any sense, Russia can't tolerate this kind of development. Second, Russian language for Russian speakers. At the beginning of the conflict, there were more than 50% whose native language was Russian. Now it's a bit less, but because Crimea is out, part of Donbas out, and then a lot of people are terrorized because extreme nationalism in Ukraine is a dominant force over there. And a kind of devaluation of power from Kiev to regions in order to let regions to have more independent policy in spheres of economy, trade, and cultural exchange with Russia. These are and then this is the reason why Russia is not going further in partition of Ukraine, though Russia had every opportunity to do that in 2014 when Putin got authority from a Council of Federation to use forces in order to protect Russians and Russian speakers. And until now, this is an option. Minsk agreements, they are not working, they are not going to work, but this is also a kind of hanged situation when everybody understands that this is not going to work, but everybody stick to this because no other option is available. What's going to happen in Ukraine, and this is my reading of the situation, and I shared a couple of thoughts concerning this in the national interest when Paul interviewed me recently, a week ago or something like that. The problem is that situation is very unstable, but situation in Ukraine is not finished yet. I think, and a lot of people in Moscow agree with me, that might be the calculation that Russia could stop, not use the force in Ukraine, not to create this Novo Russia, which was the case in 2014, because everything was ready for that. In Kharkov, mass demonstrations, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Odessa, everywhere we're waiting when Russian troops will appear and where all locals will take power and Russians and Russian speakers form their republic. Even some structures were ready. The parliament was ready, and even the chairman of the parliament. I met recently Tsarev, Oleg Tsarev, former deputy of Ukrainian parliament from the party of Yanukovych, was even considered to be the chairman of that parliament, Novo Russia, Parliament of Novo Russia, which means 7 regions altogether, and they are coming up to Dniester area, Transdniester, and Transdniester will be also part of this kind of Novo Russia, which could emerge as a result of this kind of things. This option wasn't realized, but it doesn't mean that this option is out of of the game, or it's out of sight, or just nobody is thinking about that. More and more people, they are thinking that Minsk Accord is not working. Nationalists in Kiev, they are becoming more and more aggressive. They are not ready to implement agreements on these 3 important issues, as I said, which is important for Moscow. And as a result, nobody is ruling out that military conflict could be escalated, and as a result of escalation of this conflict, there could be some serious changes in the region on the ground. Especially why I am mentioning this point, especially in light of this approval by this administration of the supply of lethal arms to Ukraine. Everybody remembers that Obama was under heavy pressure also to supply lethal arms, but at that time, a lot of analysts who were very sober, and I respected them very much, in many places they wrote that every kind of escalation of conflict over there, with the participation of United States, can create a kind of proxy war, which is unwinnable for the United States. Because Ukraine is not an existential problem for the United States. Ukraine is existential problem for Russia. And all these analysts mentioned that less than exchange of nuclear weapons, every conflict on every level will be lost by the United States, because Russia will be ready in its backyard to use every opportunity in order to protect its vital positions over there. Which means that the supply of arms, lethal arms, escalation of conflict can push Moscow openly to intervene and to decide this problem, which is long-lasting and not decided, in a radical way, which was not done in 2014. I am, this is my position, my personal position. I was in favor of this kind of solution in 2014. I wrote about that a bit later on, and this is still my position. I don't know any real plans in Kremlin concerning this, but the logic of the events are, speaking in favor of this kind of solution, which is quite possible. everybody in the West, in this city, in this country, in European capitals, everybody is speaking about Russia's involvement in Ukrainian warfare. Russia is denying that, but Russia, in a case of massive supply of lethal arms and deeper involvement of the United States, Russia will not have any problems openly to intervene and show that this is aggression on behalf of NATO and United States, and there is no other choice rather than openly, step in and protect its interests in the place which is that much important for Russia. This is the problem concerning Ukraine, because Ukrainian leaders put this, there is a deadlock. Ukrainian leaders are not ready to go further in implementing any kind of negotiations which were, which were decided in Minsk. Washington is not ready to make a pressure on them, because I think that in this, also in, I think, 2014 and 2015, I remember I wrote that in Ukraine might be the fate of future geopolitics of the world is deciding, which means nobody is going to let Russia to have a kind of country on its borders, non-bloc, neutral, friendly with Russia. This country will be used as an opportunity to make a further pressure on Russia in order to make serious changes inside Russia. But this is another topic. I'll come to that at the end of my, it's becoming long.
Yeah, it is becoming a little long. It would be good to pick up the pace.
Okay, I will, yeah. In short, I must tell you that in Syria, situation is for Russia very, very positive from the point of view of public opinion, public perception of Russia's role and Russia's actions over there, international reaction to Russia's actions over there. And I remember when Russian operation started over there, a lot of people here were telling, and even including President Obama, if I am wrong, somebody can correct me, that it's going to be a quagmire for Russia, this kind of very adventurous intervention and all this kind of thing. But it was finished by the triumph of Russia, Russian forces. Russian army became more self-confident. By the way, I was amazed. Putin recently put together some lessons or some conclusions about this operation. 48,000 Russian officers and soldiers in rotative bases were in Syria. 48,000. I was amazed. All different type of aviation of Russian army was there. All modern systems of warfare were there. More than 600 military devices, together with these engineers and constructors and others, were there just testing all this equipments and all this kind of things, which created a completely different situation. I remember when in early 90s we had seminars and Celeste Wallander was telling us that, listen, you have to disband totally your army and create an army from the scratch. Exactly what really happened since that period. This is a new army from the scratch, new armament, procurements of new arms. It's more than 50% now, and it's going to be even higher according to plans. Though economic situation is not very good, but military spendings are on the proper level, having in mind that situation is very tense and pressure on Russia is increasing, not decreasing. Third problem is Russian elections. No, Russian hacking, then Russian elections, and then concluding couple of remarks. Russian hacking, you know, again, from Russian perception, what is going on in this country, in the media, in Congress, it's just unthinkable, unbelievable, and very extravagant and hard to understand and to perceive, because until recently we were considered to be economy in tatters, regional power, just written off country which is trying to act, afford itself much more than can swallow, and all these kind of things. And now Russian people at large are amazed how great is Russian leader, how great is Russia. Russia can elect its own president in America, Russia can elect its own politicians in Europe, Russia is the most important factor in world politics, Russia is the most scary, country, and everybody is living. If in previous years we heard that nobody cares about Russia and just ignored Russia, every day since early morning until late night, all your cable news, including MSNBC, Fox, and all others, are starting with Russia, ending with Russia, Russian probe, Russian investigation, all these kind of crazy things, which means this created in Russia a sense that we are really a great country. We can really fix everything, and our leader is the best leader in the world. This is very interesting perception. From one side, Americans are talking about their omnipotency. From the other side, total impotency vis-a-vis. The funniest and the most ridiculous thing was that 100,000 was spent in advertisement in Facebook and in Twitter, and $100,000 changed totally internal political situation in this country. Everybody is thinking that the world went mad, or it's hard to evaluate, it's hard to assess, it's hard seriously to take this kind of things, but committees are forming, investigations are going on, and nobody knows when it's going to end up. And of course, nobody takes this serious in Russia, in Moscow. Nobody cares about that, and because never ever was any hard proof shown that really some hacking happened. And even, and this is usually we joked in Russia, that even let's assume that something happened, American public must be grateful, and Congress must say thank you that you opened our eyes on our politicians, how unfair they are. By the way, Deborah Wasserman-Schultz resigned because she did something wrong. And Podesta was not also in a good light when these leaks happened on the media, and nobody even in their crazy mind can say that Russian interference was in accounting the votes, registering the names, and all these kind of things which really can impact on the results of elections. Which means, but this is another problem, and that's why I am giving you Russia's perception and Russia's understanding of the situation. Though everybody knows that this has nothing to do with Russian hacking, this is internal political fight, and this internal political fight unfortunately has this kind of very negative impact in our relations. And the last the last, before a couple of concluding remarks, the last thing, Russian elections. Russian elections are going to be a very serious elections for Putin and for Russia. In advance, having in mind some lessons learning from other republics in post-Soviet space and in other places, Russian authorities decided to clean the terrain, which I don't know whether it's zachistить territory. Dmitry, is it correct to clean that? Because the problem is that several consecutive events happened which practically created the new reality in Russian politics. 100% mass media is the patriotic, state-oriented mood in Russia is dominant today. Has nothing to do with any previous periods of Russia or in other places, which means this is a consolidated position, that Russia is in siege, enemies are around, we must be united. And as a result, by the way, total consolidation of elite groups, practically economic elite groups, political elite groups are consolidated, except some minor pockets of a kind of anti-system opposition, which their weight and influence is just negligible. All these sanction efforts to create the division of elite groups, a conflict between them and president, then to create conflict between masses and the leader, just ended up in nowhere. Results are zero, at least at this moment, and sociological surveys are showing unprecedented high rating and trust towards the leader, and practically the triumph of Putin's policy of nationalization of the elite. And in this sense, by the way, I think Putin and Putin's government, they must thank United States and Westerners in their help to nationalize elites. And we are waiting with impatience your list of people who had a lot of money here, who are involved in money laundering, and who are, who must be scared about the punishment, because for many years Putin was telling them, listen, bring your money back. You could feel here safe. You will not be prosecuted. If not, then you have to deal with these people in Washington, in London, in other places, and don't, in this case, don't count on us. We are not going to do anything for you. They are going to clean you. We are going to clean you, which means we'll clean ourselves. And it means that the process is going on in the direction of real nationalization of elite. And what is important, I must tell you that a couple of groups they'll be not very happy about that, but situation is pushing in a direction when these guys will go to say with whom they are. Once Stalin said in Writers' Union Congress, with whom you are the masters of a culture. You, the oligarchs, but there are a couple of oligarchs still more or less independent. You might know and heard. The only group more or less having a voice, position, and all these kind of things, it's Alpha Group, because all others practically are the oligarchs of new generation. These are the representatives of state companies, state oligarchs, state-oriented and totally under the dominance of the state. I remember when I was asked, usually at the beginning of Putin's period, when these new oligarchs were coming out, like Kovalchuki, Protenbergi, and others, what is the difference between Khodorkovsky, Gusinsky, Berezovsky, and these guys? And usually at that time I said, listen, in a serious situation, when government will need the money of these new oligarchs, their money will be there, and they'll be distributed at the interest of the society as a whole. But Khodorkovsky's money, Gusinsky's money, and Berezovsky's money, no. They will, start all their trials, all their cries, and all their anti-governmental and anti-Russian hysterias everywhere. This is not the thing which Russia needs at this point. I am telling the logic how this everything formed and what is a current situation, which means even if the pressure will be increased, this will not bring to the confrontation and conflict in elite groups. This will bring to cleaning, totally cleaning the terrain from the forces who could be potentially, forces or resources for anti-system opposition or anti-system forces. And the last concluding, I know that, and I want to emphasize, every sober-thinking Russian analyst knows that the pressure is going to increase on behalf of the United States against Russia. Russia is going to resist, at the same time trying to maneuver and use every opportunity to create more constructive relations. But in this case, and I am just finally mentioning important thing which just came to my mind a couple of months ago, if Graham Allison's Thucydides' trap is correct, and there is inevitable the conflict and final clash between USA and China is true, then Russia's role and Russia's weight is increasing tenfold, even in this case, because in this clash between US and China, if Russia is siding one of these conflicting sides, they're gonna win in this clash. If this position of America pushing Russia in the embrace of China is giving Russia another incentives to go too far even in this direction, and I can't exclude, even if this pressure will be increased, China will understand that Russia is not fighting for its survival. This is existential problem for China. Otherwise, broken Russia, removed away, left China one-on-one against United States. And that's why for Chinese existential interest is to support Russia, to side Russia in its resistance to this kind of pressure. And I am just concluding that in this potential long run or short run, nobody knows how soon it could happen, clash, if Russia sided China, United States separately can, of course, is much stronger than China or Russia. But Russia together with China is much stronger than the United States, and this could be a tragic event really to push Russia in military, and political alliance with China. During the final confrontation, this will end up catastrophically for everybody, and I think that sober thinking analysts understand the possible consequences of this kind of development. Thank you. Sorry I was a bit longer, but we have still an hour.
We have a lot of time for discussion, and certainly a lot of material for discussion. Thank you very much, Andranik. So let's open it up. Please, yes. Please identify yourself, and we have microphones. This is Rachel Oswald.
Hi, thank you for the remarks. When President Putin presumably is reelected, there's been a lot of talk in the United States that he'll effectively be a lame duck, and we can then begin to see some of the oligarchs around him positioning themselves to take over. What then would it mean if the United States, as people in Congress are talking about right now, begins to publish and freeze Russian-held assets in the United States that are associated with corruption or something, and to push European allies to do the same? Will President Putin be able to maintain his hold on power in that type of an environment?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think I already answered to this question. President Putin and Russian public will be happy if you froze all this corrupted people's money in your country and in Europe, because they were warned, bring back your money. Bring back your money. You didn't bring, it's not our problem, it's your problem. Shoulder the problem and carry that if you can. It's very naive, the perception. If you remember 2014, 1,000 times I heard that, because late Nemtsov, whom I liked very much, but in politics he was a very naive guy, he was here in Congress, many others, target friends, personal friends of Putin, then they'll create a nightmare for Putin, they'll overthrow Putin, they do this, they do that. 3 years or 4 years passed, and we have even more consolidated power over there among these oligarchs. That's why if some oligarchs will suffer, some oligarchs will try to refrain from nationalization of this big business inside Russia. They'll put themselves automatically outside of Russian reality.
Thank you, Andranik. Who's next? Governor Gilmore.
I can go next.
Yeah, please.
Why does Russia perceive Ukraine to be an existential threat? Why does Russia perceive the Ukraine to be an existential threat to Russia?
If you look at the map, you immediately can understand that Ukrainian border is going through the heart of Russia. In military sense, in geopolitical sense, in every sense, this is a threat. If NATO installations will advance to the Russian border, they'll practically nullify every defensive facilities of Russia, because it's just next door. That's why this is, and this is not only in military sense, but Ukraine and Crimea and Kiev, if I'll remind you, this is the cradle of Russian civilization. Russian people, emerged and grew up, and Russian state grew up over there. This has also a psychological and cultural impact on everything which is going on in that space. That's why this has geopolitical, military, psychological, cultural meaning for Russia, which in this country nobody cares, and 99% don't know where this Ukraine is. But for Russia, this is really existential problem.
Kurt, and then Todd, and Steve.
Supposing by some stretch of the imagination that U.S. policymakers decided to completely reset our Russian relations and pull back the sanctions, move some troops elsewhere in NATO, that sort of thing, I think a lot of people would be concerned about what Russia's response would be. do you expect that given the current state of nationalism that there would be a push to sort of fill that vacuum, and would it take a long time to sort of open up the space within Russia for political dialogue? How would that all work out if by some happenstance policymakers here did something like that?
Yeah, very good question. You know, by the way, when I was following, and in Moscow we were following this presidential campaign, we were thinking that, of course, nobody was thinking that Trump is genius, except might be Trump himself, but it's quite normal. But when there was this clear paradigmal change in perception of foreign policy, which was formulated by Trump and his team, this really created in Moscow a hope that really something very important is happening. Really, China is targeted as the main challenge, as many realists, including your journal and Mearsheimer many times wrote about that, many others, that Graham Allison, China is the main enemy or adversary. With Russia, it's necessary to have good relations, which was Trump's position. Not on collective relations, but bilateral relations must substitute these collective relations. No Brussels, but separately Bonn, or Berlin, Paris, and other places. And in this light, normalization with relations with Russia and diminishing these small countries factors who are very noisy, but potentially very much spoiling the relations between Russia and America, which means Baltics, Poland, and a couple of others. Yeah. And we were thinking that this is really sober thinkers, real strategic thinkers in Washington are prevailing, and the victory of this administration will herald a new era in international relations. But unfortunately, I am usually when we are discussing this situation and we're comparing this with Reagan, who made his counter-revolution, Reagan's counter-revolution was prepared by neoconservatives, and that was the result of very serious losses after Vietnam and after this all, Carter administration losses in Iran, in other places. But Trump's revolution, if Trump really wanted to make a revolution, but what he usually said during his campaign, that was a real revolution. It's a revolutionary thing. By the way, I think David Ignatius wrote a piece right after the death of Zbigniew Brzezinski, that unfortunately the guy lived too long to see that the fruits of his works are just evaporating and at the edge of destruction, because he created all these supranational institutions and structures, and Trump is destroying all this, returning back to nationalism vis-a-vis the globalism. But this revolution was not prepared among establishment. And the people who voted for Trump, they are not well organized, they are less influential, and they have no real voice in Washington and in policy decision-making process. This is the problem, because Trump happened to be in one poll, his electorate in another poll, and in between a huge forces having very selfish interests and opposing this kind of sober thinking and realistic approach to international politics. That's the coming back to if this happened, Russia was ready to go as far as possible, because I don't think that any sober-thinking Russian politician is happy to be in deep embraces with China. Russia needs some room for maneuver, but Americans are not letting Russia to have this room of maneuver, pushing and pushing and pushing. Either Russia will be broken down, or America will be overstretched and broken down. This is not, I can't rule out even this option, because even North Korea showed that this huge country with enormous wealth and power can't solve the problem with this tiny rocket man.
Rick, Bert, is it directly to this?
Well, it's not on Little Rocket, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. So I'm
Okay.
going to ask you a two-part question, Andranik. But I should start by saying if somebody in Moscow has figured out a solution to the North Korean issue, let us know, and we'll give you credit. But my first question is pretty simple. If I understood your remarks correctly, you cast doubt on the utility of the Minsk Accords, the likelihood that they will be implemented. And so we seem at a dead end in Ukraine. So could I ask you, so what's the best substitute? What would you see as a way forward in finding a solution there? Is it going back to what you were talking about before in 2014, 2015, in a kind of a neutrality status, some kind of solution along those lines? But let me move to the second question, which is a little more complex. You know, normally, at least in my experience on U.S. Russia relations, which goes back to the 70s, the initiative in trying to enhance the relationship is normally, not in every case, but normally been taken by the United States. You in your own remarks, I think, explained why that can't happen now. You've got a political opposition here, a Democratic Party, which is kind of hysterical about the Russian problem and the Russian threat and so on. And you've got a Republican administration, to use a good British expression, which is all bollocksed up and can't take the initiative, can't put a strategy together to do that. So, you know, what can the Russians do? And in particular, I think there is some room for the Russians doing something in the area where in the past has been a kind of ballast for the relationship, which is arms control. As you know, we are very close to losing the 1987 INF Treaty. It is unraveling before our very eyes. That isn't just going to mean the end of an important arms control agreement, but it's going to lead to some important changes. It's going to lead to the Russians potentially deploying a new generation of cruise and ballistic INF missiles that will target the Europeans. It's already leading to the Congress thinking about the development and deployment of new ground-launched cruise missiles to counter those deployments. So we'd be back in the 1980s again in a Euro missile debate. We have a new START treaty, which is coming to an end in 4 years or so. We have the Russians in the middle of a cycle of modernizing their strategic nuclear forces, deployment of new submarine-launched ballistic missiles, 2 new varieties at least of ICBMs. And the U.S. now is getting ready to spend $1 trillion plus on a new generation of U.S. strategic offensive arms, including a new strategic bomber, a replacement for the Minuteman. And by the way, the new strategic bomber would be armed with a new stealth air-launched missile, which the Russians already are worrying could be used in some kind of first strike scenario, as well as a new class of ballistic missile submarines. So somehow it's deja vu all over again. We seem on the cusp of an enormously expensive and potentially destabilizing strategic buildup, which in the end, if you look at some of the U.S. technology, could lead Russians to believe that the Americans are seeking a nuclear first strike. Why don't the Russians, I'm sorry for the lengthy question, but why don't the Russians take the initiative here? Why doesn't Vladimir Putin get out and say, I want to save the INF Treaty. I want to try to enhance the New START Treaty. I want to reduce, if we can, as President Obama suggested, deployed offensive nuclear warheads down to maybe 1,000 or so. We'd still have a lot more than the Chinese. You have an opportunity to make offer some constructive ideas that would turn the debate around here in Washington in a very positive way. So why doesn't Putin take this opportunity?
First of all, about Ukraine. Yeah, I think that Minsk Accord is not going to work. And practically every politician in Kiev is against implementation because they can lose the power because radicals will not allow them to do that. Either it must be a very serious pressure on behalf of Washington. Washington will not make this kind of pressure on them because in Washington nobody wants that. Quite contrary, in Washington there are prevailing mood that Russia must be punished. That's why I hate to say, but on Russian television recently very often is appearing an interesting guy from Israel. He was a former head of one of the secret services of Israel, Yaakov Kedmi, and the head of Nativ. And he recently said, and he said, only force solution, using the force could solve the problem in Ukraine, and it's inevitable. Unfortunately, this is also my perception. Only the use of force, otherwise nothing can solve the problem over there. About Putin and his possible new proposals. Putin is so disappointed what's going on in U.S. Practically, this is first time that, I'm sorry to refer to a guy whom everybody knows, but might be not everybody is fond of him, but he wrote last year an article, America Failed State with question mark. It was Frank Fukuyama. And when today people are looking at Washington, they don't know with whom you can cut a deal. Who is the subject? Who is the subject? Whatever.
Who is in charge?
Who is in charge? Congress? White House? Who is making the decision? Who is the partner with whom you can? If your president is afraid to be together with Putin even half an hour, because everybody is afraid that he can be recruited as a KGB agent after that. It's the most stupid thing when they met in Germany, because they had some private talk. Everybody was thinking, yeah, might be. This was Trump was telling to his boss how he is dealing with, his instructions in America, which is so stupid. That's why until this chaos will not be ended here in Washington, nobody will take seriously anybody here, and nobody is going to discuss anything.
Okay. Todd Lindbergh, Ed, you next.
Thanks. This is in part a historical question, but it's also a question about the view in Moscow at the moment. We haven't really said much about Europe. And I was wondering if that's because there's a perception in Moscow that really this is a dialogue between the United States and Russia, in which Europe is sort of secondary player or of not great consequence, or if there's a different view and what that might be. And then also returning to your remark about the future of Ukraine as not a member of a bloc. And you mentioned specifically NATO, but you raised the possibility that there might be other blocs to which Ukraine would not become a member. Was that a remark about the European Union as well? Of course, the Ukraine crisis has its origins with an initiative on the part of the Swedish foreign minister and the Polish foreign minister to negotiate a deep EU accession, EU association agreement with Ukraine, which then Yanukovych found that he couldn't sign. So a few remarks on that subject, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll answer the second question. For a long time in Moscow, political leadership always distinguished between membership in EU and in NATO. The major concern is NATO, not EU. But EU, why EU created problem for Ukraine? Because if you remember the discussion and what happened in 2014, Ukraine wanted to be in EU, to have a common economic space, but at the same time have all the privileges in relations with Russia in economic sphere. Putin in advance warned them, listen, it's not gonna happen. If you have common economic space with them, then we are going to control our borders, our customs, gonna limit access of your goods. But nobody in Kiev wanted to calculate how much, is the trade between Ukraine and Russia, what is the share of Russian market in Ukrainian economy and trade. As a result, there was a big noise that Russia is doing some kind of discrimination and all these kind of things. But this was not the case. They said, we will not let European goods to come through Ukraine into Russian market. That's it. And by the way, Armenians turned to be much more smarter when EU said either we or Russia. Armenia said no. In this case, we are choosing Russia because Russia is priority for us in security in many other senses. But after which, last year, Armenia signed a new treaty with EU because EU changed the position. Okay, be with Russia in your alliances, but on top of that, we would like to have good relations with Armenia and be helpful for Armenia. This was completely another situation. Armenia is not in common economic space with EU. This is the problem. That's why Armenia is not creating any trouble for its allies in Eurazis, Eurasian Cooperation. Yeah. What concerns Europe, really, I think that Europe, in a military political sense, is not a serious factor. It's a great economic factor, and Russia was once greatest trade partner, but in a military political sense, nobody cares about Europe. This is the problem of Washington and Moscow.
All right. Steve, and then Paul, and then Tony Quartersman. So Steve Rademacher, right?
Thanks, Paul. My question sort of picks up where Todd's left off. I heard you in your remarks emphasize the importance to Russia of Ukraine not being part of any bloc, and you mentioned in particular in your remarks in that context NATO. And I was wondering if you could talk about relations between Ukraine and the European Union, and when you say no bloc, does that include or does that preclude Ukraine aspiring to membership in the European Union? That's my first question. You also, in describing Russia's red lines on Ukraine, I think you talked about autonomy for the Donbass region and perhaps other regions. I don't know if you have
Other regions as well, because they are demanding this autonomy. Every region, Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, and many others.
Okay. So then my second question is if you could elaborate on the characteristics of that autonomy. Would it be sort of the kind of autonomy that American states have to make their own local decisions about local matters, or would this be more of a matter of the regions having control of national policy, veto over key national decisions on certainly security, I guess, but budget issues, other vital national decisions? Would these autonomous regions have a voice in that, or would their autonomy be limited to local matters?
Oh, as it concerns NATO or EU, of course, when we are talking non-bloc status, it concerns only military affair. It doesn't concern, as I said, EU is an economic union. If they are ready to endorse or to adopt Ukraine, it's up to them. We can't do anything against this. But as I said, we are going to fix our relations with Ukraine as a member of EU country, which means you have to count, to calculate where you are winning, what you are losing, and then make your decision. About autonomy, mainly the problem of autonomy is painful because I traveled many times since the collapse of Soviet Union in eastern Ukraine, and not only in eastern Ukraine, especially in many regions. There was very painful the idea that they have to shut down all Russian schools and stop speaking Russian, learning Russian, reading Russian books, and cultivating Russian culture. Regionalization in this sense and autonomy gives the regions opportunity. Even Ukraine signed the Treaty of Regional Languages, which gives them this opportunity, but this signed treaty was not implemented for a long time, or not implemented in full its capacity. That's the major problem. And second, of course, if the regions are neighboring with Russia, to have just border trade, some ease in the relations, all these kind of things, which is quite well known when we are talking about the countries where, by the way, Ukrainians have a big communities, like Canada or some other places. Autonomies and federalization, if you can call that this way, have different forms, and they are so many. It depends on their national characteristics. But what is important and what is the problem in Kiev, though they hate what Putin once said, that this is an artificial construction, it's not a state. Once he said that in Bucharest during the summit, NATO. But this is a commonplace. Everybody knows that Ukraine is an artificial construction. Regionally, it's divided, culturally divided, religiously divided, ethnically divided. In every sense, this is a divided, deeply divided country. That's why they are afraid that devolution of power can increase the centrifugal tendencies in Ukraine, and they can't keep together the country. This is the problem.
Dmitry, you had
Andranik, I
comment.
want to follow up on Ambassador Bert's question. Obviously, there is a kind of an agreement on both sides of this great divide in Washington and Moscow that the relationship is at a very low point. There is also an agreement that the trust, how to put it, is next to non-existent. There are different views of how and why it happened, but where we are, I think that there is a near consensus that this is a very challenging situation, to say the least. But going back to Ambassador Bert's question, I understand why you were somewhat pessimistic that there could be a new Russian, a new Putin arms control, and more broadly, American relationship initiative. And I do understand that, of course, in the 1980s, this initiative came from Gorbachev, who was the new Soviet leader, and also there is a kind of a widespread belief in Russia that Gorbachev's initiative was not duly appreciated and led to a perception of American Cold War victory. Having said that, you are going to have elections. After the elections, or roughly at the time of the elections, Russia is likely to face new creeping sanctions. You have an economic bloc in the Russian government, which is widely perceived as somewhat more liberal and pro-Western, if for no other reason, because they want to keep a modicum of Russian integration in the world economy. You have somebody like Mr. Kudrin, who is perceived as being somewhat close to Putin and who is sometimes described as a potential prime minister. Kudrin is on the record that Russia needs to reduce its defense expenditure and try to look for a new accommodation with the West. Are you convinced that after the election, a combination of American pressure and a kind of a new beginning in Moscow, especially if you have a new cabinet, that it would not lead to a more flexible attitude from Moscow and a kind of a new Putin initiative? And if you don't think it will happen, why not?
Yeah, well, it's a good idea. I forgot to say a very important thing, and you now you reminded me what I missed. The problem is that to be flexible for Putin, in this city must forget about more pressure. More pressure on Russia, stronger reaction. Twice for 20th century, Russia was broken. Each time, and never in Russia's history, Russia was broken as a result of outside pressure, only because of inside, conflict and split in elite groups, and the split between the leader and elites, or people and elites. The problem is that bigger pressure, stronger, more consolidated power, and more extreme and aggressive reaction to this pressure. That's why I can't imagine that Putin, after the victory, even if invited Kudrin to government as a prime minister, can make any concessions because on any issue, because he already publicly answered to Kudrin. Once Kudrin said less spending on defense, and second, we have to improve relations with the West. Otherwise, we'll have serious economic problems. Putin's reaction, I was there when Putin answered directly to Kudrin, was there. That was 2 years ago, I think, in Valdai, in Sochi. Putin said, not at any price, which means there are something which we are not trading and we are not going to give away. If our Western partners can accept some positions of Russia, then we can go further and discuss the problems where we can agree on this or that issue. But there are some problems which we are not going to discuss, which means in Ukraine and in Crimea, these are the exact cases where they're not going to be, as I said, only in a small level. On, of course, arms control, it's a good idea, but it is not a new idea. It goes back to Soviet times, and this ongoing problem and process, I think that military people will come together and discuss this problem when really the situation will be very tense. Though I think that even if not, I can say a heretical thing, though I knew a lot of people who were involved in arms race. You might be very familiar with Israeli first deputy representative in UN, who was one of the guys, and Karpov and many others who were in charge for it. This was always in Soviet Union. There was a joke. As a student at the Institute of International Relations, usually there was a saying behind the curtains: you have to join some team who are doing this in arms negotiations, because it's an endless job. You are all your life secure and safe. You are in Vienna, you are in Geneva, you are in nice places and doing all these negotiations. I don't think that, I think on military basis, even having all these serious problems on political level, we know that our military in Syria were cooperating and informing each other, and now they are on constant contacts. And I know that one of these days your Joint Chief of Staff's chairman is going to see Gerasimov in Baku. I read that yesterday, I think, which means this is ongoing process. This is not the decisive. Usually, I always told the guys like Arbatov and others who all their life devoted to counting the metal, nuclear warheads, nuclear, delivery systems. This is secondary problem. The first-rate problem is political decisions, after which military area is too serious to leave them to military people. You know that great saying of French president at the beginning of 20th century.
Okay, let's go to Paul Pillar, who's been waiting quite a while, and then Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you for your presentation. You've downplayed the whole issue of interference in the U.S. elections, and you're clearly quite critical of the amount of media and political attention that has gotten in this country, and you even suggested Americans ought to be grateful to Russians if they exposed ignoble dealings of the Democratic National Committee.
If this is democracy, if you respect your people, people must get information.
But of course, the whole issue goes far beyond hacking into the DNC. And as you know, even if Robert Mueller were to close up shop and the other investigations were to end today, what's already been uncovered includes things such as meetings between seniors in one presidential campaign with Russians they had reason to believe had official connections and were willing to share dirt on the other candidate. So my question is, is the Russian perspective that you were describing one that says those things just didn't happen, or they happened but there was no official involvement, or maybe there's quiet satisfaction that this is just desserts for the United States given all of the interference the United States has done in how other countries choose their leaders, such as Ukraine, or is it something else?
It's a temptation to say altogether, because it's a commonplace that United States intervened in every election practically all over the globe. And this was a normal. In 1996, I was the member of a very small circle of presidential staff for re-election of Yeltsin. And you remember that a group of Americans were living in this president hotel, and on Time magazine there were the pictures how this American group is handling the Yeltsin's election. Nobody was thinking to set up an investigation group, congressional commission, attorney general to bring to the case. Everybody was thinking that it's quite normal. What happened? Yeah. I'm not talking about Ukrainian situation when your diplomats were choosing the prime minister, the president, and all these kind of things very openly, and this is also open information. But this is, I am putting aside because for us in Russia, it is absolutely not interesting. It's very, everybody was thinking that it's ridiculous. What's the problem? Some lady, a lawyer, met with the son of Trump because she considered that she has a dirt on Hillary. What's the problem? Everybody has a dirt on Hillary. I can't believe that somebody is taking seriously these kind of things. We are thinking that not only, I don't want to be insulting, but one of the important elements of this book, which everybody was discussing now, Fire and Fury, that Trump is a child. We are getting an impression that in Washington all these politicians are just children who are just doing some childish things and playing some games and fooling each other and fooling the public at large. Exactly. They are not looking at the substance. They are just looking, oh, I remember, by the way, Trump was in this sense much more mature and adult because he said, I remember during one of the debates, he said, yeah, WikiLeaks proved that being in Brasilia, you got, I don't know how many, $100,000 or how many $10,000 honorarium, and you said that we don't need borders. Instead of answering the question, Hillary said, oh, you are using WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, this is arm of KGB. KGB is the arm of Putin. Trump said, listen, I am not discussing the problems, how this information came out. I am asking you, are you in favor that America must not have borders or not? And exactly what's going on, we are looking and we are amazed. Nobody is looking at the substance. Everybody is trying to, use this kind of, the lawyer met in Trump Tower. Trump met or don't met. When Trump was in Moscow, he had relations with prostitutes or not. What kind of information KGB has on Trump and his... It's just a joke. It's not. This great country doesn't deserve this kind of circus. It's disgrace, as Trump can say.
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to everyone. By the way, the Russian New Year hasn't come yet.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we are going to celebrate. I'll be back in New York on 13th. We are celebrating Old New Year.
I have one question. Why the Ukrainian people, at least the majority of Ukrainian people, looks at West, not at East? Why do they see their future more or less with Europe, not with Russia? Although historically the two peoples have been so close culturally as well. What's your opinion on that? Many of the problems are deeply rooted in the answer of this question. Thank you.
It has a short, simple answer and a more complicated answer. The problem is when under Soviet rule, every republic was aware that Russians are living at their expense. Every republic. Though everybody lived at Russia's expense. By the way, Shmylyov published a very interesting article during the late days of perestroika showing that Russia is subsidizing all the republics because of energy resources, oil, gas, and many, many other things. And through state budget giving the money for, for functioning all this Academy of Sciences, universities, scientific institutions in all these republics. By the way, the greatest beneficiary of this was Ukraine. Not only Ukraine got practically 2/3 more territory as Ukraine could, claim or even desire, because all this Novo-Russia, then, Polish lands, Romanian lands, and many others which were, according to Ribbentrop-Molotov Treaty, were taken by Soviet Union. At the same time, they were thinking that if we'll be alone, we'll live, and that was exactly the case during right before the referendum in Ukraine, December 91. According to different estimations, they said that we're going to live like in France if we'll be independent from the Soviet Union. Now it's the poorest country in Europe, the last country, even after Moldova, which was the poorest country. But you know what is the situation? There is an expectation of miracle. We'll be in EU, EU will save us, EU will feed us, EU will clothe us, EU will do everything for us. This was the logic of many former socialist camp countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and many others. Poland, Hungary. But when they face hard reality, they are becoming crazy. It means you have to work hard, you have to rely on yourself. Nobody, and Greeks experienced that on their skin. Germany can lead and save every day, every country in European Union. That's why this kind of illusions are passing very soon. As once Oscar Wilde mentioned, the youth is the only defect which passed very soon.
All right. We had Anton, John, I'm sorry. Okay. Anton and John, why don't you go together quickly, and we'll give Governor Gilmore the last question.
I'll be quick. First of all, a very quick comment, please. I imagine if there were massive collusion between the Trump campaign and the candidacy with the Kremlin, he'd be getting his orders in a much more efficient manner than through a lawyer from the Moscow region in a meeting set up by, if I remember, a British music producer who's it's just, I'm confused. Anyway. My question, though, is about China, to bring us back to that for a second. There are three aspects to the relationship between China and Russia. There is the economic aspect, the strategic one, geopolitics, the energy one. The economic one is trying to fit the Eurasian Economic Union in with the One Belt, One Road. Of those three, what's Moscow's thinking about what's more important? Where the trend is going, how, whether they reinforce one another or not. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good, John, yeah. Of course, you broadened a little bit. This is most.
I have John Evans. I have a very short question. I remember when the upper house authorized the use of Soviet troops, Russian troops, terrible, in Ukraine. There was discussion that day by the senators of the fact that in Donbass there was industry which the senator characterized as tяжелая машиностроение, which I take as code word for important nuclear-related technology. Is that a factor in Donbass?
No, you know, if Russia decided to step in, it was not Donbass, because we had the most important factory which produced the heaviest and mightiest nuclear weapons in Kharkov. It was Yuzhmash, and Kuchma was the director of that factory. SS-18 was produced over there, and in many other places more important. Russia practically now built from the scratch new factory for helicopter engines. Though in Zaporozhye there was very important factory for that. And which means, of course, this was the most industrially advanced part of Soviet Union. Of course, now many factories are in decay, and there is a need for massive investment in order to do something with this. But Donbass, it's a coal and even the biggest metallurgical complex, which is in Mariupol. By the way, Moscow didn't let this self-proclaimed, they were advancing, they were in the outskirts of Mariupol, but they were stopped. And Renat Akhmetov's property was kept intact, which means this is metallurgical complex and coal mining, nothing important over there. But more important in science, technology, universities, this Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa, much more important places. Coming back to your question, it's very important question and very interesting question. I think that the relations in triangle, Russia, China, US, it's the most important and the most intriguing and most, it's for analytical mind, it's just endless opportunities to think about that, to calculate, to formulate. Of course, at this moment, when Russia is facing this enormous pressure on behalf of US, alliance with China is becoming more and more important and even existential, because Russia alone, for Russia, it could be hard to take all this, pressure independently, only alone. And there is a need for Chinese support, and Chinese understand that. But of course, you have to pay the price, because China, it's not a kind of, it's not a charity. In world politics, we know everything has its price. That's why I am thinking always that might be, who knows, in this city, the people will understand that there is a point of no return. If Russia will go too much further in this direction, there'll be no return. And then sense of economy, yeah, of course. And another thing about sanctions. A lot of people are talking about kicking Russian gas and oil out of Europe, at least from the areas where America has the dominance and can dictate and can substitute by Russian gas or American gas or American oil. Though this is a hypothetical situation because it's not the reality at this moment, but even in this case, Russia accelerated its pipeline building towards China and Far East in order to diversify its markets, because Russia must be ready for even further sanctions. And we are listening several kind of threats. SWIFT, to cut out from the SWIFT, Russia, China, and others are developing their own systems of transaction. Then to practically kick out from these markets, energy markets, Russia is trying to diversify in order when this time X or the day X happened to be ready to divert, this energy, gas, or oil pipes in other direction. And China plays, in this sense, a very important role. And of course, when another important thing I would like to say, in my opinion, China understands that when America at this moment is building anti-Chinese coalitions in order to refrain and to contain China, yes, India, Vietnam, Japan, Australia, and others, Russia is covering the back of China in a very safe way. That's why might be for America strategically very important to destroy the regime in Russia, to subordinate Russia, or to make Russia as a country which was once in 90s, when foreign policy was defined in State Department and economic policy in IMF. But this is the situation that Russia is different and America is different at this moment and the world is different. And that's why Russian-Chinese relations are multidimensional. And of course, America can play very well these relations between Russia and China, but now it's playing in the hands of China rather than in American hands.
Governor.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for doing this. My goal was to hear a point of view from the Russian point of view by coming here today that might be different from what I might hear from Virginians or Alabamans. But it's dangerous always to take the view of one man from Russia and think that that might be the view of everybody from Russia. But I'm not worried about China, by the way. I think we're in great shape, the United States, relative to China. That's not a concern, certainly for me. But what I guess I want to ask is this. What I've been listening for is the Russian point of view with respect to feeling defensive, fear, anxiety, fear of an independent Ukraine, perhaps of I'm trying to understand what Russia is afraid of. There isn't anybody that I'm aware of in the West that wants to conquer or suborn Russia. What is Russia afraid of on the defensive side? But then there's a second aspect which you've laid out, which I think is a part of the Russian thinking, which is the offensive side. Russia's always thought of its security as synonymous with expansion, which is the American concern. What is the vision that Russia has for the future that it seeks, both offensively and defensively? What is it afraid of on the defensive side, and what is its aspiration on the offensive side? What are you trying to do?
In 3 minutes.
Yeah.
In 3 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. We're coming back to several questions which were raised on this issue. Russia, if America would like, America can immediately decide this problem and put an end all Russian scares and fears and everything. Just declare that from this moment, no further expansion of NATO. That's it. It's finished. This is not a... In this case, Russia could feel, which means, again, as I said, non-block status of Ukraine. But, this is a very serious problem for Moscow. If you are But what is the position of NATO usually, and all this bunch of stupid secretary generals who are, substituting one another? They usually said that how we can reject the right of sovereign country to make its decision. I don't remember whether I reminded you, but I like Mearsheimer's statement on this issue. He wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, of course, Cuba had every legitimate right to have Soviet rockets on its soil. But in Washington, there was a different opinion on this. And Kennedy put the world at the edge of nuclear war because Russia has different opinion and perception of the role and place of Ukraine. And this is legit. Of course, this is Ukrainian legitimate right to make decision, but this is legitimate right of Russia to have another opinion on this issue. This is the problem. And if Washington would like, he can just put an end immediately to this problem. And no fear, no scare, just friendship forever.
Forever.
This is a very optimistic note.
All right. Thank you very much, Andranik. Please.
Thank you. It was a